invite you to introduce yourself, your country, and which university you come from in the chat box. And also, if you'd like to, you can also just raise your hand if anybody would like to introduce themselves. Okay, hi, Habe, but I'm so sorry for the mispronunciation.
It's fine, it's fine. Hello, Lara. Hello, everyone. My name is Abiba Tolatunde. I am a Millennium Fellow from the University of Lagos, Nigeria, and I'm working on SDG 4, particularly SDG 4.7, which is Education for Sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Hi, there's also Angel from India, from TKM College of Engineering. Hi, welcome. Franklin from Nigeria, who's studying in Hungary. That's really cool. So yeah, so now I'm gonna move into the introduction of today's meeting. It's going or discourse, which is going to take approximately an hour, and we will have the opportunity to meet a very, very interesting person, Miss Zoya Miari. So a lot of you who already know her and her work will have the opportunity to recall your knowledge and get additional information with references for further consideration. Those who want the gist quickly and clearly, this will be the subject at the end of the session during the closing remarks. There will also be an opportunity to ask some interesting questions to our guests. And even for those who like to review, in the end, there will be some time after today's dialogue. So, Zoya is a Palestinian Ukrainian peace ambassador and storyteller. Her life journey has given her a unique perspective, having experienced two wars and becoming a refugee twice. Through her experiences, Zoya discovered the transformative power of storytelling and the ability of individuals to shape their own narratives and the world around them. To share this vision, she founded Waves to Home, a global storytelling movement aimed at changing the world through personal stories. Zoya is currently writing her first book, sharing her life story as a message of hope for the world. As a current master student in psychology, she aspires to become a positive psychologist, helping others create meaningful lives despite the traumas they have through and guiding them towards healing. I now give the floor to Zoya.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, the MCN team, for this beautiful opportunity. I'm so grateful to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited, and we will be talking about impact storytelling. So, this is not a lecture. I don't have any presentation. All what we will be talking about is storytelling. And because this is a storytelling lecture or session or speech, there is no other better way than to start with a story, and I will be talking about my own personal story and how it inspired the work that I do today. So yeah, my name is Zoya, and I'm a storyteller myself. I became a storyteller, or I embraced the storyteller in myself, and today I share my story and I use it as an impact storytelling. So as a child, I always wanted to be this human carrying this message of love and peace. But my story did not start with peace at all. As a Palestinian in Lebanon, I grew up in a Palestinian refugee camp within a community filled with different types of abuses, violence, ongoing clashes. We would always hear gunfires, bombings, and shootings. And to me, as a child, that was my reality. That was the reality that I got used to. But later, I understood that with this reality, it comes with the generational trauma that my people have been going through the oppression and colonization. And as a child, I remember in 2006, it was the first time my family and I had to escape a war when the war in Lebanon started, and we got evacuated to our second home in Ukraine because my mom is Ukrainian. And we went to Ukraine with one backpack, and I had to fit all of my life into this one backpack. And we stayed in Ukraine for a year and a half until we came back to Lebanon. But the reality in Lebanon was still so difficult. I was very ashamed to go to the school and tell my school friends that I come from a refugee camp because of the associated stereotypes. And I was also ashamed because I had to study in the bathroom at times and because I lived in a single room with my whole family, 7 members, for the first 15 years of my life. And at the age of 15, our house got bombed because of the clashes. And that was the first time that this reality hit me hard. And I started to understand that this reality is not okay. And later, in 2021, we decided as a family that we will move to our second home to Ukraine to have another fresh start. Okay, that was in 2021. And we moved to Ukraine. And honestly, I had a happy few months because I always dreamt about traveling the world and doing solo traveling. So, of course, for someone who just graduated from university, we moved to Ukraine as a family, and I did my first solo traveling and trying to understand my purpose and what it is that I want to do in life and how I can bring this change into the world. And this wasn't until for a few months until the full scale invasion in Ukraine began in 2022, shattering us once more. And for the second time in our lives, we had to escape the war, again with a backpack, again fitting our whole lives into this one backpack. But this time something changed. I remember that when we were escaping on a train, it was very crowded, thousands of people trying to get onto the train. That meant safety, that meant life to them. And I remember my mom looking at me in that overcrowded place and telling me, like, Zoya, we should sing. And so we all sang. We started singing Ukrainian folk songs. And in that moment, something within me was telling me that I have a choice to make, whether to become a victim in life again or to become a warrior and a fighter. And in that moment, I felt internal freedom. Not even a war could take it away from me. We ended up being in Switzerland to our luck. My friends sometimes tell us that if something happens in Switzerland, then the problem is not with the country, the problem is with you. But I mean, if something happens in Switzerland, then the whole world is on fire. So when I came to Switzerland, we were hosted by a Swiss family, and this Swiss family was so kind to us, and we were sharing with them our stories, and they created a safe space for us. And in that safe space, they told me, like, Zoya, you've got a powerful story. You need to share it. And I was like, oh no, of course not. And that's how I ended up sharing my story in Switzerland and around the world. And when I started sharing my story, my intention was to change people's minds when it comes to refugees, was to raise awareness and really challenge the stereotypes that people carry within. But what I felt in the process was happening was also the healing power of storytelling in recollecting the shattered parts in my own story. So when I shared my own story, I felt that my internal prison was being gone. Because in that moment, I was sharing my own vulnerabilities and talking about my pain, and it no longer controlled me. And I knew then that that was a moment for me when I really wanted to become a peace ambassador. I was like, okay, 2 wars, twice a refugee, it's time to become a peace ambassador. So I went to Google and I'm like, how to become a peace ambassador? And I found this opportunity to join a global community of young leaders for a conference happening in Manchester. And I went there super excited and I was so inspired seeing young leaders talking about their own stories, about the challenges and how they use their own pain in their own stories to create something meaningful out of it for the whole world. And in that summit, I came together with refugees and we sat together in a circle and we started talking about our own stories. And in that collective sharing circle, something deeper was happening. We all felt this sense of belonging. We all felt heard and seen. And this sense of home that we often used to ask about, like, what is home to us? And in that moment, I understood that storytelling is not only powerful on a personal level, but also on a collective level in its ability to build a deeper connection with others. And I promised myself that when I come back to Switzerland, I would create something like this for different parts of the world because we need these safe spaces. Because in those spaces where we feel heard and seen, something starts to shift. Reframing of our own stories happens. And that is how I founded Waves to Home, which is a global storytelling movement for refugees, migrants, displaced people, and indigenous communities to create these safe spaces for them to really reflect on the stories we tell ourselves and see ourselves as warriors instead of victims. And in those safe spaces, we have been exploring the narratives that we tell ourselves about our own stories, but also about the whole world, and have been using storytelling as a tool to resist the systems that we live in. Now, in Waves to Home, we work on an approach that is called 3 Rs, which is remembering, reflecting, and reimagining. With remembering, we go back into our own stories. We remember our story. We get honest with whatever is alive in our stories, whether it's the joy in our stories, whether it's the pain, and we acknowledge whatever exists in our own stories. In the reflection part, we talk about and we dive deeper and get curious into the stories that we are telling ourselves. Like, are we seeing ourselves more as victims, or are we seeing ourselves as warriors? Have we truly liberated ourselves from within? Is there a space to liberate ourselves even more? And then when we work on liberating ourselves, we move into the reimagination part, and that is the world that we want to create. That is when we can start using storytelling as a tool to bring that change in the world. And with that, we go to this movement of inner storytelling, collective storytelling, and that impact storytelling. And this is exactly how I did it in my own story by going back to my own personal story, which is the inner storytelling. Then the collective part comes with the sharing circles when I start using my own story to talk about things, and then we become impact storytellers. That is when we use our stories to advocate for a better world, to resist the systems we live in, and then to create this change in the world. And with that, I think that with the intersection of the storytelling that we work on with peace and justice and trauma and healing, what we are truly trying to do with the storytelling is to use our own stories to end cycles of violence and create new cycles of life. And that is the impact that we are doing with storytelling. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, this was very touching. I literally got shivers. And very empowering. But now we will move to the Q&A section of this dialogue. So in this moment, I invite all of the fellows that have joined. If there are any questions for Zoya that you want to ask her, to drop them in the chat box, and we will call you for the second part of this Q&A section. And now I want to start with our first question. So you founded Waves to Home, a global storytelling movement with the aim to create safe spaces for refugees, migrants, displaced people, and indigenous communities to share their stories from a perspective of resilience rather than one of victimhood. What storytelling tips can you give our Millennium Fellows for constructing the best narrative for their individual projects?
Thank you for the question. I think when it comes to storytelling, and this is like usually the typical tips would be like, yeah, use stories in your work and use it as a tool. But honestly, the way I view storytelling is different because I see the power in storytelling in itself rather than just as a tool. Because to me, for example, storytelling really saved me and helped me get rid of so many things that were holding me back. And the way I tell my own story to myself before I tell it to the world. So, if I were to give you a tip or how it can be used in your own work, I would honestly say start by going back to your own story. Like, what is your story? What is your why? Because I think the things that are alive in our stories are the things that would push us to create that change in the world. Because I remember when I mentioned that I was doing solo traveling and trying to understand better my own story and like my purpose in life, and I met this Spanish girl and I was telling her like, in these 25 days I need to come up with like my purpose in life and so on. And she told me like, Zoya, hey, you will never find your own purpose if you don't go back to your own story. And that is how you can really know what it is that you are meant to create in this world. And that was true. I needed to go back to my own story. So rather than giving a tip, I would more question you, like what is it that you are telling yourself? What is the story that you are holding? What story is alive in you? And from that story you can better understand what it is that you are trying to create. And if you are already in the process of change making and creating an impact and so on, I would also tell you, like, go back to remembering why in the first place have you started with this project, because this would be your motivation to continuing and remembering why you do what you do. Because so many times we would start with something and focus so much on the future, on the impact, on the scaling up and so on, and we forget why we started from the first place. So the first thing that can be done is to go back to our own stories and also question ourselves, like what is the story that we are telling ourselves? Because we are living in a world where we often talk about things happening on the outside, but we don't sit on our own and question, like, what are the things that I'm holding now? What language am I using with myself? Am I being strict with myself, or am I kind to myself? So these are the questions that we can start asking ourselves. And I think when you work with someone, like we talked about the stories that we tell ourselves, it's also important to question what are the stories that we talk about, that we talk to ourselves about others. Because, for example, if we are working with marginalized communities or communities that we are trying to help, it's very important that we don't look at them as victims. We talked about how important it is not to see ourselves as victims, but it's very important as well not to see others as victims, because no one wants to be helped when we pity them or sympathize them. Even like put yourself in their shoes. If someone is like pitying you or sympathizing you, like you wouldn't really feel their help as genuine as it could be. And rather, I would tell you, like, look at it from a different perspective. Instead of seeing yourself as the savior, and we all know this white saviorism and so on, instead of seeing yourself as someone who's saving others, see it as an invitation you're giving to others in order to go hand in hand to help support each other. And this is where the power of storytelling comes in, because you would not only bring your own story to the field that you are working, but rather you would get curious about the stories of the people you are working with. And when you connect human to human, that is when this work would come to life. So this is how I see storytelling. This is like my tip when it comes to how we can incorporate storytelling. So I would say, like, use it on a personal level and use it also with others. And don't see storytelling only as a tool, because nowadays we live in a world in which organizations would bring storytelling because they know it's very important and powerful and so on, but they forget that storytelling is a power in itself and not only as a tool. So I think that is my answer.
Thank you. This was a very well-rounded answer, which I think we all have gotten a lot out of. So my second question is, you previously mentioned that there are so many stereotypes about refugees and that you want to change that narrative. The Millennium Fellowship, class of 2025, is working on a lot of projects that advance various SDGs, and they tend to encounter stigma surrounding the topics that they engage with. How can they overpower these stereotypical narratives around themselves, and the themes that are connected to their social impact projects?
So the first part of the question is the stereotypes. I think that is very much related to my own story, because as a child, I was always silent. I was afraid and I was hiding behind my reality because of these stereotypes. And I was always ashamed. So when there are like stereotypes and we are not speaking up about these stereotypes, that is when we carry shame within. And I think the first step to overcome these stereotypes is to really challenge our own story about these stereotypes, because like stereotypes usually survive in silence. When we are silent, that is when stereotypes work. But when we go back to connecting to our truth, to our story, and speak up about those stereotypes, that is when we challenge them, not only for ourselves, but also for others. So I think it goes back to really reconnecting back to your own truth and and see what stereotypes are being held about you, because it's not only sometimes the stereotypes that are being told about us, sometimes we also carry stereotypes and labels about others without really like acknowledging it, or sometimes we don't even notice it. So it's very important that we question always like what are the stereotypes that are being told about us or are being told about the people that we work with. So if I were to overcome like these stereotypes, I would say like just speak up about them, and like to really like overcome the shame that comes with the stereotypes, we need to create safe spaces, because it's said that there's a quote that says that shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces. And I truly live by that quote, because when we create safe spaces for ourselves, for other people, that is when we are able to overcome those like stereotypes and also the shame that we carry. And maybe if I want to add, like, I like as a Palestinian Ukrainian, I think that is not the best mix to be in right now in the world. And maybe like I have this both of my backgrounds like for a reason to speak up about this. But I also carry the stereotype, like my Ukrainian side is often associated with being a hero, my Palestinian side is often associated with terrorism. And I always remind the world, like, hey, I am the same exact human. And before being associated with any labels, any stereotypes, I'm a human. I don't want to be a hero. I don't want to be a terrorist. I'm just a human. And that is when like we can overcome these stereotypes when you see me as Zoya the human rather than Zoya the labels and so on. So, and again, it's through storytelling, when we combine storytelling with the context as well that's happening, that is when we can also use storytelling as impact storytelling to fight those stereotypes as well.
Very good, thank you. So I have one more question. So you have found that storytelling connects people on a human to human level, like we just discussed. So what is the best case to showcase these results and impact of an initiative through storytelling? So yeah, like how can we showcase this the best way, this initiative with the tool of storytelling, like we've been discussing so far?
People often ask us, like, how do you measure the impact of waves to home? It's a very human project. Like, how can you really measure the impact? And honestly, I always say that we cannot. Like, we cannot measure it with KPIs. I cannot measure it with numbers. Like, I cannot say that if we have shared like 1,000 stories, then that means, oh wow, we have like 1,000 stories of impact. And this is where I say, like, ever since we created like Wavestone, we're like, hey, we are going to create our own KPIs. We're not going to have the typical KPIs of sharing the impact through numbers, because honestly, like, impact is not always numbers. It's the transformation that happens in the people. And for that, you need to ask the people directly, like, how does that impact you? How does that bring you hope? How does that really liberate you to become the human you're meant to become? And honestly, like with us at least, it's mostly like collecting human stories, it's testimonials from them to really measure the impact that we are trying to create. So it goes back to the humans we are working with. And with us, like the impact is not just what we do as Waves to Home, as as a storytelling movement, but rather how we are collectively becoming together. That is how we see the impact. And I think in your projects, you can also question like what it is important to you to create, and based on your own language that you use in your own work, you would be able to set your own impact. And I think impact is very relative. We cannot like individual like categorize the impact as one for everyone. It is different for every different type of work, but something that unites us all is the process of becoming all collectively. That process of becoming together, that is impact that can be unified among all of these change making processes.
Thank you. So now we're gonna also transition to the Millennium Fellows Q&A part. I would kindly invite you again to submit your questions into the chat, any questions that you have for Zoya, so that we can get to them and answer them. And also, I invite you to raise your hand if you're comfortable with that, and we will unmute you so you can ask your question. So the first question I want to start with is by Sieda Munaza Bukhari. Um, they are a Millennium Fellow from Pakistan University of the People, USA. I'm sorry if I mispronounced this. And the question reads, what challenges have you faced when using storytelling as a peace building tool?
Yes, that's a beautiful question. So, storytelling and peace building and the challenges. Um, yes, so because we work at the intersection of peace and stories, and we use stories as a tool to promote peace, maybe like oftentimes we talk about external challenges, like the challenges we're facing on the outside, and I always talk about internal and external. So, internal challenges, I would talk about the challenges as change makers we face, which are the internal struggles basically. For example, we live in a very difficult world. For example, what's happening in my home countries in Palestine and Ukraine and also in Lebanon, that's where I grew up in. What's happening there, like I cannot talk only about the challenges on the outside, but also how much that impacts me as a human. And it's very important to talk about that because if we don't go through those emotions and don't share our emotions with others, we wouldn't be able to really connect on a deeper and deeper level. And to overcome those internal struggles, what we usually do are sharing circles. So, for example, when the genocide in Gaza started, we were all struggling, and I was struggling on my own. And something like in Arabic saying, we always say that, hey, we always struggle. We got used to struggling, but one thing we do very well is to struggle together. So if someone is struggling, why not to just do it collectively? And at the time, what we did, we brought people together, and we're like, hey, there's no agenda. Let's just come and talk. And this is how we, I wouldn't say we just overcame that challenge and there are no more internal struggles. There are, but at least it's less of a struggle. And when it comes to the external challenges, it's very important to define what peace is because we always talk about peace that comes along with justice because there is no peace when there is no justice. And this is something we always talk about. Like when we talk about peace, we're talking also about justice. And this is when we start using storytelling as a tool for resisting these systems. We use it as a way of like art. Storytelling is art, and any way of expression is art, and storytelling is one of those arts. And to overcome those challenges with the stereotypes, for example, we talked about stereotypes. That is when we bring the stories that also come with the context. Because, I mean, we all know now the stereotypes used against Palestinians in a way of dehumanizing them in the media, for example, many different media agencies that have been dehumanizing the Palestinians. And the way we were challenging that, we have been using our own stories, combining them with the context, and that is how we then use storytelling as a tool of educating people about the reality and questioning them. Like, so these are some of the challenges that we face in our process of promoting peace, and the peace that we define to ourselves. I hope I answered the question.
I would say it did pretty well. So yeah, I'm gonna move to the second question now. From Nilofor. I hope I'm so sorry for mispronouncing all of these names. Do you think all stories have the good impact? How do we ensure that our stories have the impact that centers the community we are working with?
Sorry, Laura, center is the community we are working with, right?
So the first part, so there's two parts, right? Do you want me to read the first part first and the second one after? Would that be easier for you?
Maybe, yeah, I would answer the first
Okay,
part.
then let's do that. So do you think all stories have the good impact? Like that every story has a good impact, or can a story have a bad impact? I'm pretty sure that's what they meant.
Mhm. That's also a beautiful question. Yes and no. So first of all of the stories are powerful. Everyone is a storyteller, by the way, because sometimes we like look at storytellers, we're inspired by them, and then we question, hey, but what about my story? Do I have an important story to tell? And the answer is, of course, yes. Everyone has an important story to tell. Whether it's impactful or not, it's the person who decides. Because sometimes I would say, for example, I want to share my story to make people laugh. So it depends on the purpose. So if your purpose is to make others laugh or move them emotionally or bring awareness or whatever the purpose is, you would define that purpose to yourself. And of course, if you are then using your own story, then it would be impactful. But also, when is storytelling used as a negative tool? It's when the stories are used to promote a certain propaganda. And that is when storytelling could also be a dangerous tool. It's not always positive. Because propagandas, what are propagandas? Propagandas are narratives, and narratives could be holding false truths that are spread around the world using and taking advantage of stories in order to promote a false narrative that could dehumanize others, that could lead into something the way we see it in the world right now. So, yes, stories could also be used to promote negative impact, and this is where it's our role to be very careful about stories, and that is how we counter like that is how when we use the good stories we are able to fight the bad stories. And this is why we say that we are using our own stories to resist the system, and in a way to resist those false narratives, to resist those propagandas. So yes.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on the narratives part. I think this also ties into what we were discussing earlier about the stereotypes about certain groups. That a lot of this comes from the negative narratives surrounding those, and also what the media majoritively reports on, like you said, basically propaganda. So I would say that really ties in, so everybody can get a little bit of a bigger picture to the situation. Oh, we have a question from Sadia. I'm gonna see if I can unmute you. Oh, she lowered her hand. So then the second part of this question was, how do we ensure that our stories have the impact that centers the community we are working with?
Mhm. Yes, so this is very much connected to the work that we do because most of our own stories belong to community stories as well, and they are part of the collective. So I think it's very important here to question how is our story connected to the collective, connected to the community. And once we are able to answer that question, that is when we are able to center our own story to the story of the community because they are interconnected. For example, when I shared my story as a Palestinian Ukrainian, and I was sitting with other refugees coming from different communities and also communities from Ukraine and also from Palestine. So, yes, my story is unique because it is my story, but it also belongs and has some similarities to the collective story. And this is we are when we are able to then center our own stories to bring impact to our own community. I can also give an example. For example, I've been trying to use my own story also to advocate for the Palestinians who were not born in Palestine, because people don't know much about the struggles of the Palestinians outside of Palestine, in Lebanon, for example. And then when I am able to share my story, then I'm not only sharing my own story, I'm also sharing the story of the generational trauma that comes in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, about the reality there. So this is where I'm able to connect my own story to the story of the community.
Thank you. So now I think we should do some of the raised hands. Doris, Hammond, would you like to ask your question to Zoya?
Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm Doris Hammond from Ghana, University of Education, Winneba. I would like to ask, who should be your targets in storytelling? And also, in a situation where you have a particular time frame to tell your story, what should be your focus? And assuming you have a lot to talk about within that particular story, how do you strategize it in a way that it captures everything and it captures the impact and every other thing so that the purpose you intend achieving with that particular story that you are telling is being met? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris, for your question. I think both of your questions are somehow connected about like the audience and also how we strategize our own story to capture like the impact. Um, I think when it comes to the audience, it really depends. For example, to me, most of the times people think that we are only working with the youth, but I truly believe and I see storytelling as for everyone. It's because storytelling is very human to human. So I cannot say that I want to be working with this part of the humans. So to us, at least we see that, like at least on a personal level, my target audience as Zoya, it's everyone. So it's people who have been through a lot. It's people who understand, like who are trying to turn their pain into meaning, those who have been through difficulties. And I cannot say that I only want to work with the youth, for example. But it really depends on the purpose as well. Let's say I'm invited into a conference for the youth, then I need to focus in parts of my story. So it is the same story, but then I would strategize my own story to the benefit to make sure that whatever I am saying, it will reach the youth and it is related to them. Because also we connect through emotions. Like whatever I am sharing in my own story, if I know that you as an audience will relate to that part in my own story, I know that we would connect because you're able to relate. And that is how I'm able to then shift my own message in a way that I keep it credible, in a way that I am still my own true credible storyteller, but at the same time, I'm taking into consideration who's the audience is to make sure that my story is like to make sure that the audience somehow relates to my own story. So in a way, that is about the part of the audience, and this is how I would like then strategize my own message. But I would also say that it's very important to think about two things, like it's the audience, but also you as a storyteller. So it is as a storyteller what it is important for you to share, and also to think about the audience, what is it important for the audience as well to hear. But it goes back basically to the message that you have that you are trying to bring to the audience. I hope that was clear.
I would say it was. I think, like you said, it's mostly just about what you want to achieve with your story and who you want to help. And I think this is an individual decision based on your story. So now I'm going to take the question from Sadia Mario. Sadia, would you like to ask your question?
Hello. So I wanted to ask, I just because Zoya mentioned somewhere that she sang a folk song which actually motivated her and having her thoughts that whether she would be a warrior or nothing. So I just wanted to ask her how her culture helped her in this journey of storytelling or peacemaking. How does her culture influences still now? What is the impact of her culture or her own roots to her journey of MCM?
This is a very beautiful question, Sadia. Thank you so much. I think to me, my culture, or in that situation, it was my mom, honestly. Whenever people ask me, like, who's your role model or someone who's giving you so much hope and life, I think it is my mom. And to me, my mom also represents like the Ukrainian culture, but also the Arabic culture, because even my mom lived like 24 years in the Palestinian refugee camp. So I think she's the hero in the story. I think when we were singing and when my mom asked us to sing, I think in that moment I felt like this inner freedom because we thought back then that yes, we were escaping a war and we could not change anything about it. But one thing that we could choose was our attitude because we could have just stayed like passive and like afraid and like sitting there and doing nothing and so on. But when we started singing collectively, and this is somehow connected to our culture, but also connected like to my mom and who we truly are as humans, I think in that moment I understood that there's one thing no one can take away from us. Because, like, in that moment when I realized that we're escaping war again and again and again, and our houses have been taken, our land has been taken. And I'm like, okay, but there's one thing that no one can take away from us, and it's the inner freedom that we got, it's the spirit that we got. So I think that is something that I've been holding on to so, so hard. And with that message, I was able to always be aware that it's us who always have the power to choose our own stories, to choose what story we tell ourselves. And this is something that no one can take away from us. And I think when we talk about creating change in our communities, I think the first step to creating the change in the communities is to create that change within, to really, like, when we talk about liberating our own communities, because of course whatever I am doing, it's because I want to bring freedom to my people and freedom to the oppressed around the world. And when I'm able to liberate myself and not be afraid to say whatever is on my mind, or to say whatever it is that I want to say, that is one way to do that impact. That is one way to resist. And I think that comes a lot from like, whether it's the culture, or it's my mom, or it's us as humans. But this is something I truly believe in, that no one can take away from us what we have within. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this part that you just said about the attitude and the spirit and just keeping a positive view on things is one thing that I think everybody should take away from this session, because this also kind of determines the narrative of your story, right? I, I would guess. So I would just like to remind everybody at this point to submit your questions into the chat box. If you're comfortable, feel free to raise your hand at any moment and I will unmute you. And now I'm gonna move to question 4. So as Millennium Fellows, we are working on different social impact projects. What would be your advice to ensure that we are not telling stories for the community on behalf of the community, so that we're not saying stories for somebody else? How do we ensure that our stories are authentic?
This is super important question, very important. And I think this is very important to consider when working with communities. And we always say, like, we are not working for them, but rather we are working with them. It's very important to see it that way, because again, like, we go back to this idea of, like, we are not there to save them, and our stories will not save them. We're just creating the space to really help them help themselves, because most of the communities that we work with, they know how to help themselves. They just need the space, whether it's the safe space, whether it's the resources. So it's very important to understand this. And this is, again, comes back to the story that we have about others. Because if we feel like, oh, I'm going there, I want to help them, I want to save them, I want to share their stories because they can't, then we're doing something wrong. It's very important to understand that they already have their own stories, and what we can do is to bridge their stories to the world. And this is the best help that we can do for them, which is to create the safe space for them first to process their own stories, and then think about ways how we can then create a bridge for these stories to be shared with the world, and not talk about their own stories on their behalf. Um, this is something, for example, as well with what's happening in Sudan. Like, when I talk about my home countries, I always talk about, like, it's very important to also talk about what's happening in other countries, in Sudan, in Congo, in other many countries. And I also hear so many people talking on behalf of the Sudanese, like, let's talk about Sudan. And I'm like, hey, let's give them the space to talk about themselves, because what they need is like a platform. They don't need our voices. They already have their voice, and we need to give them the space and the platform to share their voice. So this is very important to be thinking about how we are seeing others, because this will really affect the way we work with them. So it's very important to ask this question.
So maybe to consider, so what I got from this part was to consider our views of others and to give them an adequate opportunity to share their stories, correct?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I have one more question, and it's from Toba. They said that you explained so eloquently. And so, how did you overcome the fear of sharing these very vulnerable and personal stories?
Thank you so much for this question. I think this took me a lot of, oh my God, a lot of healing. But I think it all started with one step. I remember maybe I was 16 years old, and I used to go to scouts, and I never ever shared my own story. Like, Everyone used to think that Zoya is someone who's super positive and happy. And sometimes I heard people like wishing that they had my life, and no one knew that I was living in the refugee camp in a single room. Maybe that is the image I wanted to bring to others. And I remember in one of the scouts meetings, I just could not smile. I could no longer wear this mask that I was wearing because it became so, so, so heavy. And I remember the scouts leader asked me one single question, like, Zoya, are you okay? And with that single question, I was crying nonstop. And that was the first time that I shared my story with her. And of course, she was shocked because she could have never imagined this reality or this life that I was living. But to be honest, I felt good afterwards. After I opened up about everything that I was going through, after like I cried, after I felt that this was a safe space, the shame that I was carrying, all of this that I was holding on to on my own, I think that is when something broke free inside of me. And in that moment, I understood that I don't need to carry all of this pain on my own. So that was the first step to overcoming that fear. And of course, it doesn't happen at once. It's like it goes one by one, and that's when like more like this snowball effect comes in. But it starts sometimes with one person, and you just need that safety. You just need a safe space. So if you feel like you have a friend, you have a family member, someone close to you who is a safe space to you, I would really encourage you to just let it out. We don't need to struggle on our own. And sometimes, if you're not finding that person, my wish to you is to find that safe space in yourself, because we often think about safe spaces on the outside. But I truly hope to see as well safe spaces like us becoming the safe spaces for ourselves. And I remember a friend of mine one time wished me, like, she told me, like, I hope you find home inside of you in your own body. And I think that is my wish to all of you as well, to really be at home with yourself. When you are at home with yourself, you can be also a home to others. And this is what the world needs. People need safe spaces.
I really felt that this really touched me, and your story is, and this message is very, very beautiful. And I hope that everybody here in this webinar and this discourse also feels safe and at home. Like we, otherwise it's very beautiful. So I have one last question for you today. Um, when you look at the world today, a polarized, globalized world that at times refuses to listen to each other, and stories can help resist the dehumanization of communities, how do you think social media can aid in storytelling?
Mhm. I think this is the life we're living in. Like now, social media is playing both of these roles. Like we talked, it's playing the good role of storytelling, but also the bad role. It's also a space where propaganda can be used, and we see so many nations or states paying billions of dollars in order to promote a certain propaganda on social media. So this is something that we need to be aware of. But I would also see it as something that is very powerful in a way to talk about the oppressed. For example, again, like I'm so grateful as a Ukrainian. I always saw that space of social media showing so much support for the Ukrainians, to which I'm very grateful. And to my Palestinian side, I would say that as a child, we had this what is called learned helplessness, which is like we got used to this reality where no one is hearing us. This was me as a child. And nowadays, in the world that we live in, I say that social media actually played a role in really bringing awareness to thousands and millions around the world to the realities of the Palestinians today. And I think this is the power of the youth today, because I mean, like, whatever is there on social media, like now the propaganda wouldn't like it cannot play on us. Now our narrative is more powerful than any propaganda. So that's the power of social media, and this is where we need to be very critical about what type of news we are consuming, and also always to question what story we are reading, because not every story is credible. And I would go back to my message, which is the power of the storytellers, because if you really want to know about the reality that is happening, the best person that will tell you that is the storyteller themselves, those who are living those experiences. And it's important to hear from them, because with their own story, they will tell us about what's really happening.
Thank you very much, Zoya. Um, I wanted to ask you if there are now any final closing remarks or any final thoughts that you wish to share with our Millennium Fellows.
Oh, I think I have so many things, but at the same time, yeah, I think I shared so many things. Yeah, I just want to say that this is such a beautiful space, and I really hope that in this space you're also finding the safety that you need in order to get like deeper with the story that you tell yourself. And I just hope that with this safe space, you find like so much curiosity to dig deeper into your own story, into the story that you have like about the world, and maybe question how you can change it into a story that can become an impact story that can be used to really build bridges around the world, to promote peace and justice, to fight for the oppressed. And always like it just takes one step. If you feel that you have a beautiful story, which you have, it just needs sometimes one person to share it with, and then you will find the magic that it will bring to that person, to you as well. And when you use it with the wider collective, you will see the magic happening around the world. And it just needs one step to be taken.
Well, this reminded me of when I was little, my grandpa always used to tell me how curiosity is the most important thing in this world. So yeah, just very brought up some very nice memories for me also. So thank you again. And if our fellows wish to contact you, so what is the most appropriate way to do so? I would ask you to type it into the chat box below because this is shared publicly later.
Of course. So I'm happy to share my email, and I'm very active on LinkedIn and also Instagram, so I can also share that. And yeah, I wish everyone all the best. Thank you so much for having me here. And I've heard a lot about the fellowship. I see how, like now I know about it. Not only, not only I've heard about it, but also I've lived it myself. So thank you so much for everyone.
Thank you for your time and effort that you have dedicated to us today. And I'm certain that we have all learned something new, insightful, and that we've all been touched very, very deeply. Um, Lastly, for the fellows, I would like to share some quick reminders for the upcoming week. So on Tuesday, the 4th of November, there is a webinar with Giulia Fornari at 12 p.m. ET. Friday, there's on the 7th of November, there's a webinar with Sumaya Barakat at 9 a.m. ET. And on Saturday, there is a networking and upskilling hour about peace and justice at 11 a.m. ET. Finally, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today in this webinar. I hope that everybody has learned something new and that you will take this information that Zoya has shared with us today and make the most that you can with it. Thank you.